Hello. Hello, Professor Davis Smith. Could you listen to me? Am I audible?
Unmute achi. Hello everyone. So message kale.
Hello. Hello, Professor Smith. Could you listen to me? Am I audible to you? Please unmute yourself. Hello. Hello, Professor Smith. Hello. Am I audible to you? I think he doesn't listen to me.
Hello everyone.
Hello, Professor Smith. Hello. Am I audible to you? Message to call the message call. Message. Huh? नहीं जानते Hello. I think there is some connection problem.
I wonder if
yes, I can listen to you, sir.
Someone is speaking and I can't hear.
He can't hear.
You hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, sir. Hello, Professor Smith. Could you hear? Am I audible to you? And I can listen to you. Your voice is clear to me. Hello. Hello, sir. Am I audible to you? I think there is some problem at your end.
You are not audible. Unmute achi. ଆପଣଙ୍କ ଭଏସ ତ ଆମକୁ ଶୁଭୁଛି ନା ସେ ଲେଖୁଛନ୍ତି ମେସେଜ ଦେଖୁନ ସେ ଲେଖିଲେ we need to take the sound to make sure that I can hear you and you can hear me.
We can hear. We can hear him. We can hear him. We can hear you.
I don't know if anyone can hear me. Can,
Yes,
can
yes,
someone
yes.
give an indication if you can hear me?
Yes, yes. We can hear you.
Okay,
We can hear
great.
you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Professor David
I
Smith.
can't hear anyone else.
Yes, yes. A very warm welcome from Odisha, India, and all our viewers
Great.
all over Odisha and across India. They are eagerly waiting to listen to your talk. And I think we are before time, a few minutes to
So,
go.
I see.
Is it okay?
There is someone speaking, but I can't hear that
Uh-huh.
person.
Mm-hmm. But I can hear you.
इतार परे इटा एबे नेबे कि पछे नेबे
पछे नेबे
हम बोले न
सोमवार
थाव थाव इटा टिके एबे सा सा
Hello, good evening.
ସେ ଟିକେ ପଳେଇ ଆସିଛନ୍ତି।
Hello, good evening.
ସେ ବସିଛନ୍ତି, ସେ
Good
କିଛି ବି
evening.
କରୁନାହାନ୍ତି। Clarify your
English sir, good evening. Hello, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
How are you, sir?
Fine, fine.
What about your health, sir?
Okay.
Nice to meet you, sir.
ଆଗ କରନ୍ତୁ।
I am from Odisha, sir. I am
Yes.
from Odisha, Ganda.
Hello, Professor Smith. Could you hear me?
Let me check.
Yes, I can. I can hear you. You are clear and loud at
I've
this
never
end.
used Google Meet before, so I'm a little bit clumsy with this. I'm not sure what I should do. Let me check my system preferences.
Yes, yes, please.
Sound
You are clear at this end. We can hear you.
for the output.
He doesn't.
Volume seems to be okay. I'm really not sure what to do here to hear you. Okay, I'll go out and come back.
Okay, okay, then. Okay, please. Uh, a very good evening to all our viewers, dear teachers, students, and respected all. We are sorry for this. There is some technical problem, and Professor Smith is taking the time.
Can't hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, sir. Professor Smith, could you hear me? No sound from your side. Hello. Sorry, our viewers. Dr. Smith will take a few minutes to restart his system. Please bear with us.
Okay. I mean, that's it's good that you can hear me.
Yes.
So, but I would like to be able to hear you if you have questions you want to
Yes.
me and so on. Let me try restarting the computer.
Yes, yes, please,
Take a few minutes, and if that
Yes.
doesn't work, we'll manage somehow like
Yes,
this.
yes,
Okay?
yes, yes.
Okay. Let me try.
नमस्कार पुजारी सर नमस्कार सर
नमस्कार नमस्कार
टिके प्रोब्लेम होची सर तांको साइड रो टिके कनेक्शन प्रोब्लेम अछि
ପୂଜାରୀ ସାର୍ ନମସ୍କାର।
नमस्कार नमस्कार
सर नमस्कार।
We
नमस्कार
welcome all our viewers who are so eagerly waiting to listen to Dr. Smith. Dr. David Livingstone Smith is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England, USA. And his topic today is how dehumanization works. That is his topic. And we hope in a couple of minutes we'll be back with you and his system will operate.
पुजारी सर नमस्कार।
नमस्कार
सर भल अच्छी सर भल अच्छी
हाँ हाँ
अक्टोबर 2 दिन आप स्पीच शुणी बहुत भल लगे
थैंक
जो
यू
करते अक्टोबर 2 जो वेबिनार होता
थैंक यू
बहुत बढ़िया लगे लाल बहादुर शास्त्री और महात्मा गांधी का
Sir, please unmute yourself. Dr. Smith, unmute yourself so that we can hear you. Hello.
I still can't hear anything. Let me unmute. ठीक 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 वर्तमान से फोन में अवेलेबल है चेष्टा करछी हम के बहुत हम माने अछन ना एते सुन
Hello. Yes, yes. Now it is all right.
Unmuted.
Yes, yes, sir.
Um,
We can hear you. I think we are audible to you.
So I'm pinning myself to the main screen. So I don't know, we'll have to manage somehow without me being able to hear you. I'm very sorry about that. I don't know what's gone wrong, and I'm not very expert with computers, so you can manage.
Yes, please be on line. And
But I'll need someone to give me some guidance in the chat.
yes,
When you'd like me to, well, I assume you'd like me to start now.
yes, yes, yes.
And I guess I'll talk for, I don't know, maybe 40 minutes or so, so people don't get too tired of me. And then I'll, the question and answer period is going to be difficulty. Okay, I'm glad you can hear me. It would be terrible if you couldn't hear me as well as me not being able to hear you. So I don't know if we can make use of chat. At least you could send me your questions through chat. We'll see how it goes, okay? And please don't, I have the chat permanently open, so if there's anything you need to say to me, please do. Please do. My philosophy of giving presentations like this, as with teaching, is a very relaxed one. Don't feel you have to sit politely if there's something on your mind that you need to convey to me. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. It's a tremendous honor to be invited, and isn't it miraculous that we can speak to one another, in a manner of speaking, halfway across the world. I mean, this is magical, and it's miraculous, and it's wonderful. I'd like to speak with you about something that I regard is as very, very important. And indeed, that's why I study it. So, as you may or may not know, I don't have a clear idea who I'm talking to, what your backgrounds are, what your interests are, and so on. Many philosophers are not terribly concerned with what people often call the real world. Philosophers are often concerned with concepts and otherworldly sorts of things. They're not well known for getting their hands dirty. And my view of philosophy, that is the kind of philosophy that I practice, is that philosophy should be in the service of other things. It should be in the service of, well, in my case, human welfare. I'm concerned with investigating. I'm concerned to investigate matters that promise to make a difference to human life, to improve the quality of human life. In my small way, I hope to contribute to that. And one topic that I've been studying very intensely for the last 10 years or so, the phenomenon of dehumanization. Now, right away, questions might arise in your mind. Well, what does he mean? What is dehumanization? Dehumanization is a word that's used in many different ways by many different people to mean many different things. That word to mean a kind of attitude, an attitude towards other members of our species, other human beings, that treats others as less than human. So when people dehumanize other people, they think of them not as fellow human beings, but as something beneath the human, something less than they are. And this attitude is linked with some of the most terrible things that human beings have done to one another. We find it in war. We find it in genocide. We find it in oppression. There are very many historical examples of this, and I imagine we could go anywhere in the world and examining the history of the people in that place, find evidence of dehumanization. It certainly existed in the ancient world. Well, we find it in the writings of the ancient Chinese, for instance, and in the ancient Near East. But closer to home, some of the main examples that are most familiar to me are the dehumanization of African people in the transatlantic slave trade and after. And after is actually very, very important in the history of the United States, my nation. The dehumanization of Jews in Germany during the Holocaust. But also, there are just many, many other examples of this, both in the past and today. The dehumanization of the Rohingya in Myanmar is a very good example. The radical Buddhist activists who describe them as reincarnations of snakes and scorpions are in effect dehumanizing them. Dehumanization happens, I believe, and my research suggests this very strongly, because it helps human beings do terrible things to one another, to kill them, to exterminate them, to enslave them, to exploit them. And you might ask, well, why do people need help to do this? Selectively disinhibits. In other words, dehumanization is a process that makes it easier for human beings to do serious harm to other human beings. By serious harm, less than lethal violence to members of our communities. But because we are so social, these attitudes aren't limited to the immediate community. We have these inhibitions even against strangers. And we can see the evidence of this in the history of human trade, which goes back at least 40,000 years. I mean, it's remarkable. Include others in the us. us and how it's able to cause us to have strange ideas, destructive ideas about one another. Okay, so back to the first puzzle, like how could you look at me and think I'm not a human being? I mean, I look just like anyone who you would consider a human being. But if you were committed Nazis, say, in Germany in 1942, and I'm a Jew, which I am, you would see me as a subhuman, Untermensch, as they put it. Like, how is that possible? And you would see me as a very dangerous creature, dangerous subhuman. This is actually very important because, and this is just a side issue, again, which I may come back to. Look, people, pardon me, people who commit acts of genocide and acts of atrocity almost always think they're doing the right thing, that they're saving the world from evil, that they're obliterating a terrible threat. Every genocide that I've studied, the people who do the most terrible, vicious things to one another think they're the good guys, right? They think they're on the side of right and goodness and holiness, or however you want to put it. So you would look at me, if you were these committed Nazis, as some kind of a filthy, monstrous, subhuman creature. How do you do that? How do you do that? In the first place, what's going on in your head to make it possible for you to see me as non-human? That's the first issue. And the second issue is, what makes it possible for you to see me as subhuman, as less than human? So the first issue is actually fairly easily dealt with. There's a body of psychological investigation. It's about 40 years old now, 30 years old, which is research into what psychologists call psychological essentialism. And briefly, I don't want to go into too much detail about this because it would take up too much time. But I want to give you a sense of it. Basically, the idea is that we human beings, first of all, divide the world of living things in two kinds. So there are porcupines and dogs and lions and tigers and all of these things, and human beings. And what makes in our minds, what makes any individual creature a member of one of these kinds, one of these categories, is not how it appears. It's not how it looks, but it's supposed to be something inside. So there's supposed to, if we take the example of tigers, there's supposed to be something internal, unobservable, that all tigers share, that makes them all tigers. And the psychologists call this the essence. Now this idea is, scientifically, it doesn't really make much sense, but it's very deeply rooted in how we think about the world and how we think about one another. And if we look over history, there have been different ideas of what that essence consisted in. So for instance, when Black people were first enslaved by European colonists, it was widely thought that Black people did not have souls. Right? They lacked a soul, and these folks equated the human soul with the human essence. So what makes a being a human being? It's not how they look, it's their possession of a human soul. Right, so you can see how, in that case, the dehumanization of Africans was basically to deny them the human essence. And in addition to that, to think of them as having the essence of some subhuman creature. And then that gave permission to abuse them, to treat them like livestock, or worse. Okay, so psychological essentialism makes it possible for us to think that although a being looks human, they're not really human on the inside, which is where it matters. On the inside, there's something else. So we're pretending you're Nazis, looking at me, the Jew, and you think I'm not a human being. Well, what's going on is you're granting that I appear human, but I have a subhuman essence. What makes me what I really am is less than human. Now, that's part of the psychological picture, but it's not all of it. The other aspect, which is tremendously important, is what I call hierarchical thinking. And this is something which has not been studied well. There's hardly any literature in psychology about this. Most of the people who have investigated it are historians of ideas. And basically the idea is this: we human beings tend to think of nature as a hierarchy, consisting of higher and lower. In the European tradition, this was called the great chain of being. So the most perfect beings were near the top, and then the other beings were ranked below in a hierarchy, going from more perfect to less perfect. So there would be something like dirt at the bottom. In the traditional, say, Middle Ages European version, it's God, then archangels and angels, and then we human beings very modestly placed ourselves high in the hierarchy, and then mammals and birds and reptiles and fish and insects and so on, down. So we have an idea that nature is organized in terms of, it's vertical, right, with superior and inferior. In the European literature, when colonialism became established, people were divided into races, and those races were placed on this hierarchy. So in that category of the human, there were higher and lower, and of course, white Europeans modestly placed themselves at the top and placed those whom they colonized lower down. Now, in the literature, the history of ideas, I think there's a substantially incorrect view of this. So historians of ideas say, look, this was a European invention. It was invented in antiquity from ideas taken from Plato and Aristotle. It persisted until the late 18th century or early 19th century and then died out. Well, that's false in two ways. First of all, it's not exclusively European. We find this pattern of thinking in many places in the world. This idea of rank, of higher and lower, of superior and inferior. Second, it hasn't gone away. It's embedded in our psychology. Right? So all of us, even vegetarians, must kill to live. Those of us who eat meat either kill animals or are complicit in their killing, but those of us who just eat plants are as well, right? Plants are living things. And to deal with this problem that life feeds upon life, we have this attitude that, well, some kinds of life just don't matter, right? That you can treat a goat or a carrot differently than it's permissible to treat another human being. And this is very bound up with ideas about race as well, because when we think of people as belonging to racial categories, if I had time, I would talk a lot about that, because like many philosophers, I think race is just a toxic, destructive fiction. We think of higher and lower, and we imagine that the lives of some people don't matter as much as the lives of others. Right? So this is what gives us the idea of the subhuman, this whole hierarchical notion. So psychological essentialism and hierarchical thinking together make it possible for us to think of other humans as merely appearing as human beings, but being something different, something dangerous, something inferior, something less than on the inside. And then that paves the way to atrocity. So I see I'm getting close to the limit of my time, but I do want to introduce something which is extremely important, and then we'll see what happens in the question and answer period through the chat, okay? And my hosts, Suchitra, just, feel free to tell me what to do, okay? I'm very cooperative. And I love sharing ideas with people. And once again, I'm very grateful to be invited to share my thinking with you all. Okay. So I mentioned early on, so I've been talking about the psychology, what it is about us, about the way we think, that enables us to think of others as less than human. But I also said right at the beginning that this is only comprehensible if we look at it in a social and political context. Thank you, Amia. I will take another 15 minutes. Thank you. That'll give me just the time to make the crucial point I want to make. So we have to look at it in a social, political context. These ideas about other people don't come from nowhere. They come from somewhere. And you can see this just by studying the history of human atrocity. It's clearest, of course, in well-documented genocides. When people dehumanize others in genocidal contexts, it's in response to social and political forces. There are either, well, it's actually usually both. There's usually both a deeply entrenched ideology, a system of beliefs that's just sort of baked in to the culture, and has been for a long time. And there's usually efforts by people in positions of authority to produce propaganda to ignite those entrenched beliefs and feelings, to ignite them. So in all of these, these well-known genocides and lesser-known genocides, we find efforts by people in positions of authority to convince us that those others over there are lesser beings and do not merit the concern and respect that we owe fellow human beings. And it's very interesting, I think, and very important. And it's actually very important, I think, for your nation right now, at this political moment, to understand this. I mean, it's the case all over the world. All over the world now, we have the rise of authoritarian regimes. And authoritarian regimes, by their very nature, emphasize the division between us and them. There is some other that needs to be marginalized or persecuted or harmed or thought of as evil or thought of as criminal or essentially destructive. And it's very important to understand how leaders in these regimes can seduce us into these beliefs. That's why, my newest book has the subtitle of it. It's my newest book on inhumanity, and the subtitle is Dehumanization and How to Resist It. The point of understanding these things is to develop strategies for combating dehumanization, right? Otherwise, it would just be, of intellectual interest, and I don't waste my time with that. Okay, so what do? Well, in explaining how this sort of dehumanizing propaganda works, I'm very, very influenced by the work of a man, an Englishman, named Roger Curl. So let me tell you a little bit about him and the nature of his work, and then we can kind of wrap it up, and I'll respond to whatever questions you have. Well, it's not really wrapping it up. I see the chat here, so I can, as long as questions come up on the chat, I can just respond to them in an ongoing way after I cover this crucial piece. So Roger Carl came from a wealthy, aristocratic English family. He fought in the First World War, was shot down, and went off to university to study philosophy. He completed his philosophical education not at Oxford, where he began, but in Vienna, which was a center of philosophical activity in the 1920s when he was there. He came back to England and actually got a second PhD in anthropology and became a practicing psychoanalyst. When he was in Vienna, he entered analytic treatment with Sigmund Freud. So he was an interesting man. In 1932, a friend of his, a diplomat named Arthur Jenkin, invited him to visit Germany. And in Germany, Carl attended these rallies that Hitler held. This was an intellectually turbulent time. The Nazis really come to power, have a majority in parliament in 1930 for the first time, and then Hitler comes to power 32 and becomes dictator in 1933. So there was a lot of political activity, and Carl attended these speeches, and he was fascinated by what he observed. And he wrote a paper about this, which was published, pardon me, to clear my throat a lot this morning. I think it has to do with getting up early to meet all of you. It's still dark outside here. Right, so he wrote it up in a paper which was published in 1941, almost 10 years later, called The Psychology of Propaganda. And it's got some really good stuff in it. So let me abbreviate what he found. He found that, he said Hitler, in all of the speeches that he attended, did essentially the same thing. And it's the thing that authoritarian politicians do. It's very effective. First, Hitler would make his audience feel depressed. That seems strange, doesn't it? That a politician would try and elicit this idea of hopelessness and helplessness, but it's part of a pattern. Once you see the pattern, it's obvious why that happens. So in Hitler's case, he would say, well, Germany has suffered tremendously. We've been humiliated. We've betrayed our great destiny, the great destiny of our people, and it's all our fault, and we are the laughing stock of the world, and so on. So he gets this his audience to feel terribly, terribly sorry for themselves and their plight, gets them to think that everything is bleak and depressing and hopeless. And then, you see, and then he changes his tune. And he says, well, yes, but it's not really us. It's not really us. It's the communists. It's the Jews. It's the international bankers. They are our enemies. And then he goes along these lines for a while, essentially describing some other group of people as demonic, metaphorically. Of course, in previous centuries, it was literally. If we look at propaganda in the Middle Ages, it was they meant demonic in a literal sense. All right, so he demonizes some other. He dehumanizes some other. Some frightening, terrifying, monstrous other. And then he offers a magical solution. Only I can rescue you. I will make Germany great again. I'm the only man. I am your savior. I am your God. I'm all powerful. And human beings, in their sense of helplessness, which is exacerbated by this sort of propaganda, very readily accept this kind of message. You know, this is something that Sigmund Freud understood very well. Part of the human condition is to be aware of our vulnerability and helplessness. Our helplessness in the face of the forces of nature, like deadly pandemics, of famine, of flood, of the inevitability of old age and death, and the death of our loved ones. We are helpless in the face of that. We can take some steps, but in the end, nature wins. And we're also vulnerable to human injustice, to cruelty, to exploitation. So Freud thought, you know, this is part of the human condition. So human beings have this craving for salvation, this craving for deliverance. And he understood religion in that way, as Marx kind of did, as motivated by the yearning for safety from the forces of nature and the forces of human injustice. And what the skillful politician does, the politician who gets us to dehumanize others, is play on that sense of vulnerability, wind it up, exaggerate it, send these distressing messages which impact on our psychology because of the psychological features that I described earlier, to win us over, to do terrible things to one another. So to understand dehumanization and to protect ourselves from it and to fight against it, which I think is incredibly, incredibly urgent now, we need to understand both something about our vulnerability to this way of thinking. And we all are vulnerable. We really are. We like to think of, you know, the people like Hitler and other people who have done terrible things. We like to think of them as monsters, but they're not monsters. They're human beings. Monsters don't exist. As soon as you start thinking of people as monsters, you're dehumanizing the dehumanizers. And that prevents us from grasping really what's going on here. So we need to understand our own vulnerability to these sorts of attitudes. We need to understand we are not immune from them. There's no vaccine to protect us. And we need to look outward into the world and using whatever means we can to combat those who would have us think of other people as less than human creatures who deserve to be killed or harmed or exploited. Okay, I guess I'll wrap now, and let's see if there's anything you want to ask me. There's already a question. There are two questions here. One from, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Pranya Daskanugo. Pranya Daskanugo, right? It's somewhere near how it should be pronounced, I hope. Who says, "Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Smith, my question is, how can dehumanization be stopped? And how can one get over the hierarchical thinking which is natural to man?" That's actually a very deep question. So, I think we should have a modest goal. As long as there are people in positions of power and authority who can influence us, I think there's an ongoing vulnerability to dehumanization, to dehumanizing others. And this is particularly the case when people feel desperate, when circumstances are such that they're already feeling very vulnerable, and then these people can exploit our feelings of vulnerability. So, as I indicated, one crucial component is understanding ourselves, understanding our vulnerability, so we can be vigilant, so we can monitor ourselves and notice when we're slipping into this way of thinking. Another, which I didn't mention, is historical education. Every group of people has blood on their hands. Nations are born in violence and they're sustained in oppression. And it's very, very important for us to learn, for young people to learn history properly, because then they will understand that we, whoever we are, I mean, in my case, it's white Americans, have done awful things to other people, have dehumanized other people. And you see, that is important, because if you learn that, if you accept that, then you must understand that it can happen again. And maybe it is already happening again. Maybe you just haven't noticed. So historical education is very important. Then there are various forms of political action and the support of institutions that at least have the potential to protect us. A free press, freedom of speech, a free and independent judiciary. All of those things can be undermined, and they have been repeatedly in dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. This is not a magical solution. Dr. Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, once said that the greatest joke of democracy is that it gave us the tools for destroying human freedom of speech. I think most important of all of these things are the material conditions in which people live. By that I mean a basic security that people are getting enough to eat, that they have stable employment that pays them enough to not dread where their next meal is coming from, or whatever other hardships are possible. Of course, this is all relative. What happens, what makes Americans sometimes feel desperate would make to others would seem immensely luxurious. But the point is, people with full bellies are less likely to dehumanize others than people with empty bellies. People who are not oppressed are less likely to dehumanize others than people who are, and so on. Because there's not the same basis for this toxic political appeal. Now, none of these are just absolute solutions. It's as is always the case with social phenomena, it's a very, very complex thing of considerations, and we really need to pay attention. I mean, we need to pay attention to this because the hideous history, I don't want, and I assume you don't want, the hideous history that human beings have lived through from time to time in our journey on this planet to be repeated endlessly. And we are faced with some very unique challenges, chief among them being climate change. Climate change is going to create many, many, many millions of refugees. And that means shortages, and that means collapse of infrastructures, and that means very probably dehumanization and violence. So we need to be prepared for these things, in my view. Okay, the hierarchical thinking bit. I know this is a long-winded response, and you can always tell me to shut up. I say that to my students all the time. Just tell me to shut up. But they're always too polite and scared to do that. I really don't mind. Hierarchical thinking, I think there's good reason why it's there, even though it does not make any scientific sense. And I don't think it can be abolished. Again, if I had a great deal of time, I could explain why I think that. But it certainly can be modified. And it's certainly the case that it's possible for human beings not to think hierarchically about one another. So even if we think hierarchically about mosquitoes, say, and maybe that's necessary or almost necessary, we can't avoid thinking hierarchically about one another. But this requires something else which I've not had the opportunity to get into today, but it is very important, which is ideas about race. The fact is, groups of people who are dehumanized are almost always first racialized. And I mean something very particular by that, because part of my work involves an analysis of what racial thinking is, and I understand it a bit more broadly than many people do. I think the very idea of race, which is basically the idea that there are fundamentally different kinds of human beings, and what goes with that is this notion of hierarchy, because we invent this idea that they are fundamentally different than us historically and generally to oppress. Some group of people it's advantageous to oppress, to make slaves of, to exploit. And the ideas about fundamental difference arise because they legitimate, they help us to harm others in this sort of way. We really need to get rid of race. Unfortunately, I'm not an optimistic person. I'm hopeful in that I think we should struggle to make the world a better place, but I'm not optimistic about the result. And it would really be another lecture or another conversation to explain this a bit more fully. Okay, here's another question. My question is, this is from Sashibu-san Rath, if I'm pronouncing it somewhere near correctly, and if I'm not, my apologies. My question is, dehumanization is an historical process. It will end one day. But after that, what? It'd be nice if it, maybe it'll end when we end, because we will end. Like other creatures, we will go extinct. I mean, we're working very hard at driving ourselves to extinction right now. I don't think it's helpful to try and predict the future. generally speaking, philosophers and scientists, by the way, have often had a very bad track record in predicting the future because our imagination is limited. Who knows? Who knows? After that, what? I don't know. I don't know if there will be an after that. So what I'm concerned with is less a long-term forecast, which would be probably bullshit and inaccurate. Less that than addressing the immediate problems that we are presented with, and which we have been presented with for a long time and in various forms. Okay. There's all kinds of things I missed about being introduced to the audience. Okay, anyway, let's see. Anish Chakravarti says, considering welfare and well-being of a society through dehumanization is good leads to a paradox. Why still people are compelled to keep practicing it? They're compelled to keep practicing it because this is a bit of an oversimplification, but it's true enough. Because it's in the interest of some people to get us to keep practicing it. Right? Like I've said, it doesn't just happen. People get it to happen. Think of the destructive political discourse bound up with dehumanizing attitudes, and you'll see that. Kageshwar Dash says, is subjugation of women in patriarchal societies an act of dehumanization? If yes, how to resist it? Okay, that's a really, really good question. I make a distinction between the oppression of women and dehumanization. So women are certainly dehumanized, but it's not because they're women. And to say that women are not dehumanized because they're women is not to say that women are not oppressed in patriarchal societies. And virtually all societies are patriarchal, just by the way. So I make a distinction. I think the distinction is important to make because, look, there are lots of attitudes that are related to one another, but not quite the same. So racism, dehumanization, and dehumanization, as I suggested, are very closely related. Sexism and misogyny, the discrimination against sexual minorities, the discrimination against disabled people, and so on. These are all distinct things, and they all deserve our attention. But to attend to them properly, to deal with them properly, we have to understand how they work. I mean, if you're wanting to take something apart, as I hope we all want to do with these things, we need to understand how they're put together. And the way, I think the way that the oppression of women in patriarchal societies operates is significantly different from the way dehumanization, as I've described it, operates. So I want to separate these things out. And there's a very large literature, as I'm sure you know, on misogyny. And I think those analyses need to proceed, along the track that they proceed, just as the analysis of dehumanization needs to proceed. And nothing is to be gained by mixing these things up. Again, so how to resist patriarchal oppression? Well, there are people much more qualified than myself to respond to that. There's a great body of feminist political and philosophical literature that addresses precisely that question. That's a difficult question. All these problems are difficult problems, but they're so deserving of our attention and our efforts. Okay. Anit Kumar Dash says, hello, Dr. Smith. I have a question. Can empathy be used as a tool to gradually remove the effects of dehumanization at grassroots level? And if so, how do we channel our empathy for our close ones towards the members of the other human groups? Again, this is hard because empathy empathy can work two ways. First of all, it's possible to be empathic towards others while at the same time thinking of them as inferior or even less than human. People are empathic to pet animals, right? Even wild animals, they can be empathic to. Also, empathy tends to be often biased. We're more empathic to certain groups of people than to others. So empathy isn't a solution. I think what is closer, and maybe this is what you're reaching towards, is identification, right? So the capacity to see others as one of us, as our kind, right? That's how the idea of human works, really. Human means my kind, in a very deep sense. How do you get that to happen? Well, it's not easy, because as I suggested earlier on, dehumanizing attitudes are often deeply ingrained in a culture and can go back hundreds or even thousands of years. They're hard to get rid of. But we can certainly fight against those who would encourage us to exclude others from the us. That's for sure. And we do have something to work with there, because if I'm right, human beings have a fundamental tendency to recognize others as fellow human beings. It's not something fancy and conceptual. It's like bang at a gut level. You look into a human face, you look into a pair of eyes, and I think you just cannot help seeing human. So dehumanization has to operate against that basic human tendency. So in trying to cultivate inclusiveness and identification, I think we have human nature on our side. It's the toxic ideologies and the authoritarian politicians who need to be handled here. Okay. So at the grassroots level, I mean, you're asking a really practical question there. And the way that question gets answered, it's going to depend upon very specific circumstances. The circumstances particular to the culture that one is operating with. So I'm not sure. I have thoughts about what we need in the United States for white people getting over the dehumanization of blacks. But that's going to be different in very important respects to what would be needed in India, or what's needed in Angola, or what's needed in Myanmar, or whatever. Right? There are considerations of cultural and political specificity here. So anything I said that was very general, I think, would be either meaningless or stupid. Once we understand the general principles of how dehumanization works, we can adopt that to the specific circumstances in which we're trying to deal with it. Okay, I'm just going down. If there's any, oh, you're all saying such nice things. Thank you so much. You know, it's so important for a thinker to know that others have found their thinking valuable and significant. So, you know, your responses, I assume they're all sincere, mean a lot to me. They really do. Okay. So why, this is Prakash, Realm of Learning, who thanks me and then asks, why are human beings in the grip in some way of either inferiority complex or superiority complex that lead to hierarchies and dehumanization? Will dehumanization come to an end because it continues since time immemorial in spite of tremendous knowledge and intelligence about humanity and the character of sociability? Right, so we need to look at the circumstances in which hierarchies are formed. They don't come out of the air. They're formed, I think, we can see this in the history of race. They're formed in circumstances where it's advantageous for one powerful group of people to subordinate, to oppress another, to exploit them. It's, you know, the historical, in the historical examples, certainly the ones that I've studied, this is quite clear, and this is a fairly standard analysis. So hierarchies are born of struggle between peoples, right? The idea of superiority and inferiority is simply a way to justify relations of domination. So it's the relation, the problem is, of course, once this is established, it seems to be common sense to the participants in the hierarchy that, well, of course, we are superior to you. It becomes so baked into the culture, so rooted in the culture, that people start thinking of it's just obvious. It's just clear. It's just obvious that those people over there, African Americans or the Tutsi or the Dalits, just obvious that they're inferior, right? And it's that vision of humanity which needs to be modified. But this is very hard. Here's all I can tell you. This takes a long time of steady work. There's no button we can push or switch we can push. And it requires courage. So I know that's very general, and I'll just go back to what I said about the previous questioner. It depends on the specifics of the cultural forces that we're dealing with in any given case. Okay. How can we determine or measure, this is Aben Kizan's question, how can we determine or measure the degree of dehumanization? How can the gap of dehumanization between rich and poor be minimized to ensure peace in our society? Well, you've mentioned something very important, which is economics. You know, when I said earlier, if people do not feel unnecessarily vulnerable, if they have enough income to have a decent life and to have full bellies and don't have to worry about putting food on the table, don't have to worry about violence from others because they're protected, they're less likely to accept dehumanizing propaganda. And so economic considerations are central to this. Economic justice is central to this. Now, how do we achieve economic justice? That's now there you need to speak to people with expertise in that area. I am not an economist, and it would be foolish of me to pretend. I know economists largely disagree, but that's how it is. That gap is a very, very important gap, and that gap, by the way, is often very closely related to ideas about what I call race, ideas about fundamentally different kinds of people. These people are poor because of how they are, right? Not their circumstances, not the way they're historically situated and so on, which is, of course, the most important consideration when we're examining poverty. Poverty is a crucial thing in many respects in the dehumanization conversation. How do we measure the degree of dehumanization? Well, not everything is measurable. Social scientists nowadays would like us to think it is, but it isn't. We can only do this very roughly. We look at how people talk about each other, which is the best key to how they think about each other and how they treat one another, right? So historically, if we go to, say we're studying this in the past, we can go to historical documents, and you know, it's pretty clear. And we can do the same in the present. But this is very rough. It's not something which is really quantifiable, in my view. Okay. Bishnadeb Padhan asks, if dehumanization is an attitude of looking other in an inferior way, then using the term civilized society, uncivilized society, developed and underdeveloped, modern and tribal, is this dehumanization of the tribal
I
society?
will request our viewers to please stop asking questions for a moment so that we can introduce
So
our
if we look in the past, we have this
very
idea.
learned speaker to you all. We will have a formal
and many
beginning of the
people
meeting.
like savages,
So
as
please
primitives,
stop asking questions for a moment.
and
After we finish the business
were
session,
thought to be
formal
effective,
welcome
barely
session.
human.
Then
even
you can
subhuman. This kind of language, civilized, uncivilized, developed and underdeveloped, and modern and tribal, plays into dehumanizing ways of thinking very, very often. It's a kind of language we should really avoid, right? There are some differences between that way of thinking and dehumanization as I've described it, but let's say they're neighbors. And once we start thinking in terms of civilized and uncivilized and so on, we're on our way to dehumanization if we're not already there. Okay. I will stop taking
Yes,
questions now, Ania Patra, and I'll allow you to introduce me. Unfortunately, I can't hear you.
Yes,
But I hope
we
you're
are so
saying nice.
we are so sorry that because of these technical glitches, this has become a one-way business. Our so learned
You just
speaker
let me
of
know
our
when you want
day,
to continue again.
Professor Dr. Smith, he cannot listen to us. Audio is not working from his side. So let me welcome in a formal way all our viewers. Of course, the session is almost at the end. We have come to the fag end of the session, but we welcome all our viewers, all our audience, teachers, students, our well-known professors all over India and across the world. Dr. David Livingstone Smith is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England, USA. And today's topic is how dehumanization works. Now, I will request our honorable principal, Professor Khageshwar Das, to present his formal welcome address. And after that, Professor Suchitra Mishra, head of the Department of Philosophy, he will introduce our speaker for the benefit of all our audience. Now it is over to Professor Khageshwar Das.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, yes.
Esteemed Professor Smith, the prime attraction of today's webinar, and Dr. Amiya Kumar Patra, the moderator of today's webinar and the head of the Department of English. Ms. Suchitra Mishra, head of the Department of Philosophy as well as coordinator of IQAC team. All the faculty members and staff members of Kuchinda College, my dear students of Kuchinda College, esteemed faculty members from different institutions across the country, especially Professor Sudarshan Pujari sir, former head of the Department of Philosophy of Kuchinda College. We are so proud of you, sir. And all the participants. I take this opportunity of extending a very warm welcome to all the participants and especially our invited speaker, Professor Smith. And I do congratulate the Department of Philosophy for have organized such a beautiful and great webinar. And because of the pandemic, this could be made possible. We may not have invited Professor Smith physically to our institution. Anyway, at a row, we have been able to organize so many webinars, and it is all due to the team effort of my esteemed colleagues. For today's webinar, I do congratulate the entire team, Dr. Patra, Ms. Chitra Mishra, Ranjit Pradhan, and also the technical team, Devadatta Bhoi, Roshan Kullu, Dr. Divyakanti Bilung, Ms. Sasmita Minj, and Ms. Hemsila Maji. So I am so delighted that because of having such a great team, we have been able to organize seminars like this. And once again, I welcome you all, and I hand over the mic to Dr. Patra.
Thank you, sir. It's so nice of you, although we have to say all these things with a heavy heart, that Professor Smith could not listen to these nice words about him. And it is not many days back that I did listen to Professor Smith in a webinar organized by Sacred Heart College, Kochi. And there he was talking about what human beings has done to their own kind. And that was such a passionate talk by Dr. Smith. And he's obsessed with this idea of dehumanization, what mankind has done to its own kind. And he has written book after book, like The Making of the Demon Less Human, on Inhumanity. These are the books where he explores the reasons, the psychological reasons, the social reasons, and maybe something wrong in human beings that makes him torture in a very inhuman way his own fellow beings. And here I remember a line by Sri Aurobindo, who said that the tigers, they are in some way spiritually higher, in a higher plane than us, that they never harm their own kind, what we do. So I think this is a very intellectually very stimulating speech delivered by Dr. Smith, and it would have been more vigorating if we could have exchanged our words with Professor Smith. Now I request Professor Suchitra Misra, head of the Department of Philosophy, who has painstakingly organized this webinar, planning over so many days, that she will introduce our audience at length about Dr. David Livingstone Smith, his works, his passions, what other things he do. And let me tell this much, that Dr. Smith is a very popular figure in USA, and he occupies the prime TV time there, and he stages talk shows there and goes on talking night after night about this topic on dehumanization. Now, I request Professor Suchitra Misra to take over the microphone and tell our audience at length about this extraordinary speaker of this evening, Professor Dr. David Smith.
Namaskar. Actually, it is much annoying that Dr. Smith is not in a position to hear we all. Still, it is our responsibility and our